I thought I had all the answers until a little girl I'd never met asked me, if I'm no longer here, where will I go? That question, so soft, so small, shook something loose inside me that had been locked up for decades. I didn't answer her. Not because I didn't want to, but because for the first time in a long time, I realized I didn't know. It started on a Thursday. I had just finished a grueling 3-day sprint at SpaceX headquarters. Endless meetings, launch simulations, investor calls, and one hell of a PR fire to put out. My brain was fried, my body screaming for rest, but as always, I kept going. People think I'm some kind of machine. Maybe they're right. Maybe I trained myself to be one. But that night, I couldn't power through. I found myself driving aimlessly through LA. I didn't want to go home. I didn't want to go anywhere, really. I just drove. Somewhere on the edge of town, I passed a small, worn-down chapel. No lights. No cars. Just this quiet little building wrapped in moonlight and silence. I don't know what made me stop. Maybe it was the stillness. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Or maybe, for the first time in years, I needed to feel something I hadn't let myself feel, peace. I parked the car, walked up the stone steps, and pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The air inside was cold and smelled faintly of incense and old wood. The place was empty. Completely. I stood in the doorway, half expecting someone to tell me I didn't belong there. Because honestly, I didn't. What was a man like me doing in a place like this? A man of science, logic, reason. The only higher power I'd ever bowed to was physics. And yet, something kept me rooted there. I walked slowly down the center aisle, the sound of my footsteps echoing against the walls. I stopped halfway to the altar, staring at the crucifix ahead. The figure of Jesus, silent, carved, unmoving, seemed to be watching me. I swallowed hard. Then I whispered, "Why am I here?" It wasn't a question meant for anyone. Just the kind of question that slips out when you're too tired to hold it in anymore. But somehow, it got an answer. The first sound I heard was my own heartbeat. Loud. Thunderous. Like it was trying to break out of my chest. Then, a voice. Soft. Calm. But unshakably certain. "Why do you doubt?" I froze. I thought I imagined it. A side effect of stress. Maybe sleep deprivation. Maybe my mind finally cracked under the weight of too many expectations. But no. The voice wasn't in the room. It wasn't in my ears. It was inside me. It was like someone had reached past my logic, past the walls I'd built, and spoken directly to something deeper. I turned around quickly, nobody there. I was still alone. Still, the voice came again, firmer this time. "Why do you doubt?" I clenched my jaw, trying to fight the surge of panic rising in me. My whole life had been built on certainty. On proof. And now I was standing in a church, hearing a voice that shouldn't exist. I backed away toward the exit. But just as I turned, I heard something else, something that made me stop in my tracks. The door creaked open again. And in walked a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Long brown hair. Wearing a faded hoodie that was a size too big. No adult with her. Just this tiny, serious-looking kid walking straight up the aisle like she knew where she was going. She didn't look surprised to see me. Or afraid. She just walked right up to the pew I was frozen next to and sat down. I stared at her. She stared at the crucifix. Finally, I asked, "Are you lost?" She shook her head. "No." "Where's your mom or dad?" She shrugged. "What's your name?" She looked at me and said something I'll never forget. "Does it matter if I'm not here tomorrow?" I blinked. "What do you mean?" And then, without looking away from me, she said it. "If I'm no longer here, where will I go?" Her voice was so calm. No fear. No tears. Just pure, childlike curiosity. But it hit me like a punch to the chest. I sat down next to her, slowly, cautiously, like I was approaching something sacred. "Why would you ask that?" She turned to me. "Sometimes I dream of leaving. Not just here. Everything." I couldn't speak. My throat closed up. Elon Musk, man of ambition, speaker of countless keynotes, launcher of rockets into space, had no words. Because I saw something in her eyes. Something I recognized but had long forgotten. That emptiness. That deep ache of not knowing why you're here, even when everyone tells you you're special. She looked down at her hands. "They tell me I'm smart. But I don't feel anything. I feel like a machine." I almost laughed, but not because it was funny. Because for a moment, I didn't know if she was talking about herself or me. I wanted to tell her something comforting. Something that would light her up inside and give her peace. But all I could say was, "I know how that feels." We sat there, in silence, for a long time. Then she asked, "Do you believe people are made for something? Like, actually made for it?" I didn't answer. Because honestly, I didn't know anymore. That night, I walked her home. She didn't live far, just a few streets away from the chapel. A small, plain house with chipped paint and flickering porch light. She didn't say a word the whole walk, and neither did I. Before she went inside, she looked back at me and whispered, "Thank you for listening." Then she disappeared through the door. I stood there, frozen, staring at the place where she had been. And something in me cracked. Back in my car, I gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. All my life I had pursued answers about the universe, about Mars, about AI, about the future. But I couldn't answer one simple question from a child. If I'm no longer here, where will I go? That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my desk, staring at an empty screen, asking myself the same question over and over again. Where will I go? What was I really building toward? What was the point of creating entire futures if I couldn't even explain what this life meant? And that voice I had heard in the chapel, it lingered. It kept asking me, like a quiet storm whispering through my soul, "Why do you doubt?" That was the beginning. The beginning of the unraveling. Or maybe, the beginning of something finally being rebuilt. But at the time, I had no idea where it was heading. All I knew was this: I had launched rockets, disrupted industries, and chased the stars. But none of it prepared me for the journey I was about to take. A journey inward. A journey backward. A journey home. You know how sometimes, you walk through a door thinking it's just another moment, but somehow, when you try to walk back out, you're not the same. That was me, standing at the back of that chapel again, 3 days after I met the little girl. I told myself I had come for answers. But deep down, I knew the truth. I came because I couldn't stop hearing her question. If I'm no longer here, where will I go? That wasn't just her question anymore. It had become mine too. I'd spent the last few days pretending nothing had changed. Meetings. Prototypes. A meeting with the Pentagon. A call with NASA. Another strategy session with Tesla. Another email about AI ethics. Another late-night code review. But I wasn't there for any of it. Every room I walked into, I saw her face. Not just her, actually, hundreds of faces. Children in war zones. Women with cancer. Men sleeping on concrete sidewalks beneath billboards of my own face. They flashed before my eyes like a slideshow of everything I hadn't done. I tried to silence it. I told myself I was imagining things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing inside me, and I was either going to fight it or follow it. So I went back to the church. The parking lot was empty again. The air was cold. The night was quiet. When I opened the doors, they creaked the same way they had before, slow, ancient, like something waking up. Only this time, I didn't walk in as the man who had built rockets. I walked in as a man with a question in his soul. The church was silent. Still. Heavy. I sat in the same pew as before, my hands clasped between my knees. My eyes were fixed on the crucifix at the front, the same carved face, the same outstretched arms. But it looked different this time. Not physically. Spiritually. I felt like I was being watched. Not in a creepy, paranoid way. In a way that made my whole body feel seen. Known. Exposed. I stayed there for what felt like hours. Then, just like before, the voice returned. You came back. 3 words. That's it. But somehow, they carried the weight of the world. Yes, I whispered, unsure if I was speaking out loud or inside my own mind. I don't know why. You came because you're listening now. That stopped me cold. Because it was true. I'd spent most of my life talking, on stages, in interviews, in boardrooms, on timelines. I had filled the world with my voice, my thoughts, my dreams. But I had never stopped long enough to listen. And now that I had, something had started to shift. I looked around the church again. It was still empty, but it didn't feel empty. It felt crowded. Not with people, but with presence. Memory. Mystery. Then, the voice came again, so soft, it almost felt like breath. You have touched the stars, but forgotten the ground beneath your feet. I closed my eyes. My throat tightened. Was that true? Yes. God, yes. I had built machines that could leave Earth, but I hadn't looked closely at the Earth itself. Not really. People admired my vision. My risk-taking. My relentless push toward the future. But how many lives had I truly touched? How many people had I seen? The little girl's face came back to me again. They tell me I'm smart. But I don't feel anything. I whispered into the stillness, what am I supposed to do? The voice answered without delay. See. Just one word. But it echoed like thunder in my chest. See what? I asked. And suddenly, it was like the air inside the chapel split open. I wasn't dreaming. I wasn't hallucinating. I was somewhere else. The walls faded. The pews dissolved. I was standing in the middle of a vast white light. Not blinding, but endless. Peaceful. Expansive. And then, images. Not just images. Moments. I saw a young boy watching a SpaceX launch on a phone with cracked glass. His eyes were glowing. I saw a team of engineers clapping as a rocket landed upright, something people had called impossible just 5 years ago. I saw a woman in a hospital bed using a neural implant to move her fingers again after a stroke. I saw impact. But then, the light changed. And new images came. A single mother crying over a foreclosure notice. A teenager in a dark room, surrounded by screens, feeling more alone than ever. A child watching their village burn while a drone buzzed overhead. And then, I saw her again. The little girl from the chapel, sitting on a swing. Her face was blank. Hollow. Waiting for someone to notice. I dropped to my knees. I couldn't breathe. My chest heaved as tears fell down my face, fast, messy, real. All the things I had ignored, all the people I had missed in the race toward the future. They were right here. And I had passed them by. Why are you showing me this? I whispered. The voice was closer now. Inside me. Because you've been building a future, without asking what it's for. The words cut deep. I had built systems. Ecosystems. Worlds. But I never stopped to ask what kind of world I was leading people into. Then came the hardest words of all. You are not the creator. You are a vessel. I flinched. Because that hit something inside me I hadn't wanted to name. My pride. My need to be the answer. To own the future. To be the one who proved everyone wrong. And in a single moment, All that pride crumbled. The rockets, the millions, the fame, the innovation. It was all sand in the wind compared to this feeling of truth now piercing through me. I dropped my head into my hands. I don't know what I'm doing, I admitted. I thought I did. But now, silence. Then, you were made for more. The words didn't come with fireworks, or choirs, or anything dramatic. They came with warmth, stillness, like being wrapped in something ancient and kind. Something that saw all of me, my flaws, my mistakes, my striving, and chose to love me anyway. I stayed there for what felt like hours. Maybe it was only minutes. I don't know. But when the light began to fade, and the church came back into view, I knew. Something had changed in me. I stood slowly, my knees shaky, my hands numb. I walked back down the aisle toward the doors. When I reached the handle, I stopped. Because the moment I touched it, the voice came again, soft, final. You cannot walk through this door the same man who entered it. I paused, took a breath, and whispered, then who am I now? There was no answer. But I didn't need one. Because maybe the real transformation doesn't come from hearing the voice. Maybe it comes from listening and deciding what to do next. That night, I didn't go back to the office. I didn't go home. I went for a walk. No phone. No cameras. Just silence. And in that silence, one question burned in my mind. What if the future I was building was never about rockets or riches? What if the future I was building was me? You ever carry something for so long that you stop feeling how heavy it is until the moment you try to put it down? That's what the days after the chapel felt like. I tried to go back to normal life. But normal didn't fit anymore. I walked into the Tesla design lab and stared at a new prototype for 15 minutes without seeing a single thing. At SpaceX, someone asked if I had reviewed the next launch strategy. I had, but I remembered none of it. Even my assistant noticed. You okay? She asked one morning. You've been different. I forced a smile. Just thinking. But the truth? I wasn't thinking. I was waking up. And for the first time, I was starting to realize all the things I had missed while I was sprinting toward the future. One evening, I sat in the back of my private office, lights off, city skyline flickering outside the window, and opened the notebook I usually kept for ideas. But instead of diagrams or business plans, I wrote one sentence. What if I've been successful at the wrong things? The moment I wrote it, my chest tightened. That question scared me more than any failure I'd ever faced. Because I had one. Over and over. In every way the world said mattered. And still, I felt like I'd lost something important along the way. That night, I did something strange. I left the office, walked out into the city with no destination in mind, and started following people. Not in a creepy way. I just wanted to see people. Really see them. A woman pushing a stroller past a row of neon-lit shops. A street vendor wiping sweat from his brow under a flickering bulb. A man in a hoodie sitting alone on a bench, watching traffic like it was a movie. They weren't in my keynote slides. They weren't mentioned in shareholder reports. But they were the people I was supposedly building the future for. And I had never really seen them. The next day, I told my executive team I needed a week off. They stared at me like I had grown a second head. You don't take time off, one of them said. I know, I replied. That's probably part of the problem. I packed a small bag. No schedule. No team. No entourage. No private jet. I just disappeared for a few days. I didn't go anywhere glamorous. No luxury resorts or mountain retreats. I found a quiet Airbnb in a forgotten part of the desert. There was no signal. No internet. Just time. And quiet. And space to feel. It's incredible what happens when there's nothing left to distract you. The mind starts to open. The walls begin to drop. And the questions you've been running from finally catch up. I spent entire mornings just staring at the sky. At night, I sat by the window and listened to the wind. And every single day, I wrote. I wrote about fear. About ambition. About how easy it is to use achievement as a shield against emptiness. I wrote about the little girl. Her eyes. Her question. And I wrote about the voice in the church. You are not the creator. You are a vessel. At first, those words made me feel small. Powerless. But the more I sat with them, the more I realized, maybe being a vessel doesn't mean being less. Maybe it means being aligned with something greater. One night, as the sun dipped behind the rocks, I opened my notebook again and drew a line down the center of the page. On the left, I wrote, the future I built. On the right, the future I want to build now. It wasn't easy. Because the left side was filled with everything I had staked my identity on: Mars colonies, autonomous cars, AI networks, cryptocurrency, hyperloops, neural integration, progress, progress, progress. But the right side? It was harder to define. More vulnerable. More human. I wrote things like, a world where no child feels unseen. A world where silence is respected, not feared. A world where we use technology to listen, not just to speak. A world where purpose matters more than profit. And then I circled one line and read, a world where I can look a child in the eyes and say, you are not alone. That was the moment something cracked open inside me for good. Because for the first time, I realized I hadn't just been building the wrong things. I'd been building alone. Yes, I had teams. Yes, I had partners. But emotionally, spiritually, I had been alone on a pedestal. Untouchable. Untethered. Worshipped and isolated at the same time. And that isolation? It's not strength. It's silent suffering. On my last night in the desert, I stepped outside into the cold air and looked up. The stars were stunning. It's funny how I spent so much of my life dreaming about reaching them, but I had forgotten how beautiful they are just being. They didn't need to go anywhere. They didn't need to do anything. They just were. Present. Silent. Brilliant. I thought of that little girl again. Her voice echoed in my chest. If I'm no longer here, where will I go? Maybe the question wasn't just about death. Maybe it was about meaning. If I disappear tomorrow, will I have mattered in the ways that count? Not to headlines. Not to tech blogs. But to hearts. The next morning, I packed up and drove back to the city. But everything looked different now. The buildings were taller, but not impressive. The traffic was busy, but not urgent. The noise was louder, but I didn't feel the need to add to it. I walked into my house. The walls felt emptier than they ever had. I sat in the living room, pulled out my phone, and opened my notes. I scrolled through page after page of ideas I had jotted down over the years. Startups. Tech solutions. Futuristic predictions. And then, quietly, I created a new folder. I called it The Second Half. And in it, I wrote one line. I don't want to impress the world anymore. I want to impact it. Later that day, I walked into the church again. The same wooden pews. The same silence. But I was different now. This time, I didn't come to ask questions. I came to listen. I sat there for over an hour, waiting. And just when I thought maybe I was imagining everything that had happened, the voice returned. Are you ready? I nodded. And whispered, yes. But, ready for what? To become who you were always meant to be. I left the church that evening with no script, no plan, and no idea how the world would react to the man I was becoming. But I knew this. The future wasn't just a place I wanted to visit. It was a responsibility I wanted to carry, with humility, not hubris. Not because I had all the answers, but because I had finally asked the right question. There's a moment in every journey, quiet, unassuming, when you realize the road ahead isn't about discovering something new. It's about becoming someone true. For me, that moment came the morning I decided to speak. Not to a boardroom. Not to investors. But to the world. I sat in my study, sunlight stretching across the hardwood floor, my phone heavy in my hand. On the screen, a blank post. No hashtags. No edits. No pitch deck. Just a blinking cursor, waiting for me to be honest. Not strategic. Not visionary. Just honest. I took a breath, closed my eyes, and started typing. When I walked into that church, I was a man with answers. But I walked out with a question that changed everything. I paused. My hands trembled. I'd faced critics, skeptics, entire industries doubting me. I'd taken billion-dollar risks on rockets that could explode. I'd stared down financial ruin more than once. But this was scarier. Because this wasn't about my company. It was about me. My soul. My doubts. My silence. My awakening. And I didn't know how the world would respond. Would they mock me? Say I'd lost my mind? Would they think I'd gone soft, or worse, irrelevant? I almost deleted it. Almost. But then I remembered the little girl's voice. If I'm no longer here, where will I go? And I hit post. The reaction was instant. First, silence. Then, chaos. Some people were moved. Others were brutal. Some called it profound. Others called it pathetic. A PR stunt. A meltdown. A God phase. A midlife crisis with better lighting. But buried in the noise were voices. People I'd never met, writing things like, "I've been feeling the same thing, but didn't have the courage to say it. I thought I was broken. Maybe I'm just not alone. Thank you for showing that even someone like you can have doubts." And one message that made me stop breathing for a moment. "You just saved my life." I stared at that line for a long time. Because I hadn't saved anyone. I'd just told the truth. And for someone out there, truth was enough. That week, I canceled every media appearance. Every interview. Every product launch. Instead, I met with a team I trusted and said, "I want to use the next 12 months to build something different." They waited for the pitch. I said nothing. Because I didn't have a pitch. I just had a conviction. "I don't want to launch anything," I finally said. "I want to listen first." And so, I listened. To single moms. Veterans. Teenagers. Pastors. Teachers. Nurses. Ex-cons, refugees. Scientists. Artists. Farmers. Counselors. Skeptics. Spiritual seekers. I listened to people who had nothing in common except one thing. They felt invisible. Forgotten in the rush of a world moving too fast. One afternoon, a young man looked me straight in the eyes and said, "You build rockets, man. But can you build space for people like me?" That question haunted me. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I finally understood it. Yes. Yes, I could build rockets. Yes, I could build companies. But more importantly, yes, I could build space. Space for honesty. Space for pain. Space for healing. Space for questions without answers. And that realization led to the boldest decision of my life. I stood before a packed auditorium a few months later. Not as a CEO. Not as a disruptor. Just as a man who had been disrupted. I stepped onto the stage. No slides. No product to unveil. Just my voice. And a mic. I'm not here to talk about Mars, I began. I'm here to talk about what brought me back to Earth. The room went quiet. I shared everything, the chapel, the voice, the vision, the weight of ambition, the little girl, the long nights in the desert. I told them I had been wrong. Not about technology, but about purpose. I had mistaken progress for meaning. I had mistaken noise for significance. And somewhere along the way, I had mistaken being known for being whole. When I finished, there was no applause at first. Just stillness. And then, someone stood up. Then another. Then 100 more. A standing ovation not for innovation, but for vulnerability. For the risk of being real. That night, I knelt beside my bed and whispered a prayer. Not out of duty. Not out of tradition. Out of desperation. God, I don't want to waste the rest of my life chasing shadows. Help me build something that lasts, not in code, but in people. The next morning, I started drafting something entirely new. Not a business plan. Not a speech. A letter. To her. The little girl. I had gone back to the chapel several times, but never saw her again. I didn't know if she was real, or a vision, or both. But she was in me now. So I wrote, Dear one, I don't know your name, but I know your question saved me. You reminded me that intelligence without love is empty. That genius without gentleness is dangerous. That building futures without seeing people isn't progress at all. You made me stop. And in stopping, I saw myself for the first time. You were right to ask where you'd go if you disappeared. Because maybe all of us should ask that. Not out of fear, but out of courage. The kind of courage it takes to be real. Thank you. Wherever you are, I hope you're still asking brave questions. And I hope someone is listening this time. Because I am. I used to think life was like engineering. A blueprint. A plan. A flawless equation waiting to be solved with the right logic, the right timing, the right code. But that was before. Before the chapel. Before the little girl. Before the voice that shattered my certainty and stitched it back together into something softer, something stronger. Before I realized that life isn't built. It's offered. And all you can do is say yes. The post I had written about the church, about the question that haunted me, went viral. Not in the usual way. Not with clickbait or controversy. But because it felt human. It got shared in church basements. On Reddit threads. On YouTube channels about grief and hope. In classrooms. Therapy groups. Veterans shelters. Even corporate town halls. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about what it stirred in others. I started getting letters. Thousands. Some were handwritten, trembling with pain. Some came from inmates. Others from CEOs. One was from a 10-year-old girl in Michigan. She wrote, I asked myself that question too. Thank you for not laughing at it. I didn't reply to every letter. I couldn't. But I read them all. And somewhere between the pages, I saw something bigger than me. A quiet thread running through every line. It wasn't religion. Or belief. Or politics. Or intellect. It was hunger. A hunger for meaning. Not the kind that's shouted on stages or posted on social media, but the kind that trembles in silence. That aches in the quiet moments of night. That says, I've done everything I was supposed to do, why do I still feel empty? One evening, I stood in my living room and stared at the dozens of framed awards lining the shelves. Innovator of the Year. Time's Most Influential. Person of the Decade. Billionaire lists. Scientific milestones. I stared at them for a long time. And then, I started taking them down. One by one. Not out of shame. Not out of guilt, but because I no longer needed them to remind me I had value. I stacked them in a closet and replaced them with something else. A photograph. Just one. A simple black and white image of a wooden pew in a dimly lit chapel. Empty. Still. Sacred. That's where I'd met myself again. Or maybe, for the first time. I knew I couldn't disappear. Not completely. The world still watched. The media still speculated. The market still moved. But I didn't need to run from it. I just needed to live differently within it. So I did. I started showing up not just with strategy, but with soul. When I spoke, I didn't hide my questions. I told stories instead of forecasts. Shared mistakes instead of mantras. Invited silence instead of filling every second with solutions. People noticed. Some were confused. Others relieved. One engineer approached me after a team meeting and said, "You feel more human now. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." I smiled. Because the truth was, I wasn't doing anything anymore. I was just being. A few months later, I walked past the old chapel again. This time, it was raining. The steps slick. The doors shut. I stood there, letting the rain hit my face, waiting, hoping, maybe, to see her again. But the doors stayed closed. No little girl. No voice. Just me, standing alone in the same place that had cracked me open. And I realized something. I didn't need the vision anymore. Because now, it lived inside me. The next week, I launched a foundation. Not for innovation, but for restoration. We called it the More Project, after the words that echoed through me in that first moment of stillness. You were made for more. Not more status. Not more speed. Not more success. More presence. More purpose. More people. We funded counseling programs in schools. Built listening centers in communities. Gave scholarships to kids who had never been seen, never been heard. We trained engineers to lead with empathy. We taught leaders to ask better questions, not to dominate, but to understand. And slowly, quietly, something began to shift. Not just in others. In me. There were days I still doubted. Nights when I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was doing enough. If I'd waited too long. If I'd changed too late. But in those moments, I remembered something the voice once whispered in the church. You are not the creator. You are a vessel. And being a vessel means it's not about being perfect. It's about being willing. One night, about a year later, I was asked to speak again. It wasn't a product launch. It wasn't even televised. It was a candlelight gathering held in the chapel where it all began. Someone had seen the photo I shared online and reached out. We want you to tell your story in the place where it started. I agreed. No stage. No script. Just a single mic on a stand in front of 100 people sitting in wooden pews. I stood there, hand resting on the back of the seat I'd once collapsed into, and said, when I walked into this room, I thought I was a man who had seen everything. But I hadn't even seen myself. I paused. No notes. Just breath. And then, a little girl asked me a question that I couldn't answer. And maybe that's the real beginning of growth, when you stop pretending you have it all figured out, and you let life change you. That night, I met something greater than logic. Greater than success. Greater than me. And it told me this. You were made for more. Not more to earn, but more to give. Not more to build, but more to become. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't moved, but because peace had finally replaced the ache. Afterward, someone came up to me quietly. She couldn't have been more than 10. She tugged gently on my sleeve and asked, "Are you still looking for the answer?" I smiled down at her and replied, "No. I think the question was the answer." She tilted her head, confused. And I knelt to her eye level and whispered, "It's okay not to know where you're going. Just don't stop asking why you're here." She nodded, solemnly. Then slipped back into the crowd. I watched her walk away. And for the briefest second, I thought I saw her. The girl. Her. Was it her? Or was it just the light? I'll never know. But this time, I didn't need to. Now, when people ask me what I'm working on, I give them a new answer. I'm not working on a product. I'm not working on a company. I'm working on myself. And through that, hopefully, helping others find the courage to do the same. We don't need more billionaires. We don't need more breakthroughs. We need more truth, more depth, more presence. And above all, we need more people asking the question that changed my life. If I'm no longer here, where will I go? Not as an escape, but as an invitation. To stop chasing. To start becoming. To live this moment as if it matters. Because it does.